chapter 8, and the title is The Cost of Taxation. After studying this chapter, these are the questions that we need to answer. How does a tax affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus? What is the deadweight loss of a tax? What factors determine the size of this deadweight loss? How does tax revenue depend on the size of tax? Let's review chapter 6 a little bit. And in chapter 6, we saw that a tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. It raises the price buyers pay and lowers the price sellers receive. It reduces the quantity bought and sold. These effects are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. Graphically, let's look at the effect of a tax. Here is a graph at equilibrium at PE and output at QE. And this is equilibrium before any tax is imposed. When the tax is imposed, this red vertical line is the size of per unit taxed. So equilibrium with tax, that's per unit, buyers now pay price PB and sellers receive PS from the original PE. PE was the equilibrium price before the tax. After the tax, the buyer pays more, PB, the seller receives less, PS, and the quantity sold in the market is reduced from QE to QT. Revenue from the tax is the area of this triangle. If you calculate the area of this triangle, it's the revenue that the government collects. Let's look at without tax. The triangle ABC is the consumer surplus. And the green triangle FDE is the producer surplus. And total surplus is A, B, C, D, E, and F. The larger triangle is the total surplus, which is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. With tax, consumer surplus shrinks to A. Producer surplus shrinks to F. And tax revenue is B and D. We said that the tax drives a wedge between consumers and producers, and you can see the tax revenue is right between consumer surplus and producer surplus. So total surplus is now A plus B plus C plus D, which is this trapezium here. There is a CE, a small triangle, which is now called deadweight loss. That is C plus E. It is called deadweight loss of the tax. The fall in total surplus that results from a market distortion such as a tax. It is a loss that goes to nobody. The consumers lose it, the producers lose it, and the government does not get the revenue. And of course, QE minus QT is the amount by which the market has shrunk. The tax distorts the market shrinks. Let's look at a learning exercise. Number A, compute consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without tax. Number B, now assume that there is $100 tax per ticket. Compute consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, total surplus, and the deadweight loss. It is a market for airplane tickets. Before the tax, the upper triangle is the consumer surplus, the yellow area, and the green triangle is the producer surplus. And the total surplus, with tax, for example, with tax, the yellow area shrinks, gets smaller, the green area gets smaller. As you can see, with tax, consumer surplus is 1/2 times 150 times 75. That's the area of this smaller yellow triangle. Producer surplus is also 5,625, which is the area of this green triangle. And the tax revenue is the area of this rectangle here, which is 100 times 75. And the small blue triangle is the deadweight loss. We have lost 1,250, which is the area of this triangle. Determinants of deadweight loss. Price elasticities of supply and demand. More elastic supply curve, larger the deadweight loss. In other words, if the supply curve is elastic, suppliers can leave the market if they want to, there is a larger deadweight loss. On the demand side, if demand is more elastic, the deadweight loss is larger. The greater the elasticities of supply and demand, the greater the deadweight loss of a tax. So here's a graphical example. This is a situation where supply is inelastic. You can see supply is fairly steep. That means inelastic. It is harder for farms to leave the market when the tax is imposed. So in other words, the supply is inelastic. Suppliers don't have much of a choice. They will stick to the market when the tax is imposed. So the tax only reduces output a little, and the deadweight loss is small. You can see the deadweight loss is the area of this yellow triangle, and the market shrinks from right about here to here. The loss in terms of deadweight loss is fairly small when supply is inelastic. When supply is elastic, as you can see, the supply is fairly flat. That means elastic. Okay. The more elastic is supply, the easier for farms to leave the market when the tax reduces producer surplus. The greater quantity falls below the surplus, maximizing quantity. In other words, when suppliers have a choice and they can leave the market when they want to, when they respond to the tax increase, more of them will leave, and the market shrinks by a larger amount, which means a larger deadweight loss. Let's look at the demand. When the demand is inelastic, demand curve is fairly steep. When demand is inelastic, it is harder for consumers to leave the market when the tax raises the price that buyers pay. So the tax only reduces output just a little bit. In other words, consumers, this is buyers, the demand side, buyers don't have much of a choice. When you increase tax on them, they're still going to pay it. So the loss in terms of deadweight loss is fairly small. The tax only reduces output a little bit, and therefore deadweight loss is small. When demand is elastic, as you can see, demand curve is fairly elastic. The more elastic is demand, the easier for buyers to leave the market. When the tax increases, the price buyers pay. The more quantity falls below the surplus maximizing quantity, and the greater the deadweight loss. In other words, if consumers have a choice and you raise tax on them, more of them will leave the market, and the loss, the area of this small triangle, is maximized, is large. Elasticity and the deadweight loss. This is a learning exercise. Would the deadweight loss of a tax be larger if tax were on breakfast cereal or sunscreen? Number A. Number B, hotel rooms in the short run or hotel rooms in the long run? Number C, groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Let's look at number A, breakfast cereals or sunscreen. From chapter 5, breakfast cereal has more close substitutes than sunscreen. So demand for breakfast cereal is more price elastic than demand for sunscreen. In other words, consumers have more choices in breakfast cereal. So a tax on breakfast cereal would cause a large deadweight loss as consumers will shift and buy some other stuff than the tax on sunscreen. Number B, hotel rooms in the short run or hotel rooms in the long run. Also from chapter 5, the price elasticities of demand and supply for hotel rooms are larger in the long run than in the short run. So a tax on hotel room would cause a larger deadweight loss in the long run than in the short run. Number C, groceries or meals at fancy restaurants. Also from chapter 5, groceries are more of a necessity and therefore less price elastic than meals at fancy restaurants. Consumers don't have much of a choice. If you raise tax on groceries, they will still buy groceries. So a tax on restaurant meals would cause a larger deadweight loss than a tax on groceries. Here's a discussion question. The government must raise tax revenue to pay for schools, police, and etc. To do this, it can either tax groceries or meals at fancy restaurants. If you are advising the government, what would be your advice if the goal is to minimize the deadweight loss? Case study, how big should the government be? A bigger government provides more services but also requires higher taxes, which causes deadweight loss. The larger the deadweight loss from taxation, the greater the argument for smaller government. Tax on labor income, especially important, biggest source of government revenue is income tax. So if the marginal tax rate is about 40%, how big is the deadweight loss? How big should the government be? 40% labor tax is small or a large deadweight loss? What do you think? Some believe labor supply is fairly inelastic, almost vertical. Most people would work full time regardless of wage. So, in other words, even if the government imposes tax on labor, people will still work anyway. The argument is that the loss of deadweight loss is going to be small. Tax on labor leads to small deadweight loss. Others, labor supply is more elastic. Labor taxes are highly distorting. Some groups of workers have elastic supply and can respond to incentives. Tax on labor leads to greater deadweight loss. Many workers can adjust their hours. Some families have second earners, some discretion over whether and how much to work. Many of the elderly can choose when to retire. Some people work in the underground economy to evade taxes. Ask the experts. The Laffer Curve. A cut in federal income tax rates in the United States right now would lead to higher national income within 5 years than without the tax. What do economists say? 9% disagree, 48% are uncertain, and 43% agree with this statement. Effect of changing the size of the tax. As the tax increases, deadweight loss increases even more rapidly than the size of the tax. Of course, tax revenue increases initially, then decreases. The higher tax drastically reduces the size of the market. So this is an example of the effect of tax. Initially, the tax is T. T, that red line, is the tax. That corresponds to the deadweight loss, the area of that smaller triangle. If you double the tax, okay, you can see that you double the deadweight loss. The new area of this trapezia is more than twice as large as that initial deadweight loss. So doubling the tax leads to a larger, more than double the size of the deadweight loss. What about if you triple the tax? Tripling the tax leads to these deadweight loss, and therefore tripling the tax more than triples the deadweight loss. So the summary here says when tax increases, deadweight loss increases even more. What are the implications of this? When tax rates are low, raising them doesn't cause much harm. As you can see, the slope increases slowly, and lowering them doesn't bring much benefits either. However, when the tax rates are high, when the tax rate is already high, you can see the slope of this line rises very sharply. So when the tax rates are high, raising them is very harmful and cutting them is very beneficial. Raising them is harmful because it leads to larger deadweight loss. Lowering them leads to benefit because it lowers the deadweight loss. When the tax is small, in this graph, when the tax is small, increasing it causes tax revenue to rise. So at this point, when the tax is this line T, the government revenue is the area of the yellow rectangle. When the tax is doubled, the new tax revenue is, so the tax is doubled, but the revenue that goes to the government is not doubled. Okay? When the tax is small, increasing it causes tax revenue to rise. When the tax is larger, increasing it causes tax revenue to fall. So as you increase the tax rate higher and higher and higher, government revenue shrinks and becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So here is a case where tax is now tripled. And when the tax is tripled, it leads to this revenue. Okay, it gets smaller. So you have tripled the tax, but you are collecting much less revenue. And that means the Laffer curve looks to be this shape. Okay. The Laffer curve shows the relationship between the size of the tax and the tax revenue. So you can increase the revenue by raising taxes. You can raise taxes, moving it this way, and the revenue rises until it gets to a certain maximum point. There is just one point where tax is maximized. If you raise taxes beyond that size, then tax declines. Okay, sorry. When you raise taxes beyond this point, as you continue to raise taxes, tax revenue will go down. So in the example, we saw that when you raise tax and you double tax, revenue goes up. But when you triple the tax, then the government revenue goes down. So the Laffer curve shows the relationship between the size of the tax and tax revenue. Now, what do the experts say now? A cut in federal income tax rates in the United States right now would raise taxable income enough so that the annual total tax revenue would be higher within 5 years than without the tax cut. 96% disagree with that statement. 4% is uncertain. Summary. A tax on a good reduces the welfare of buyers and sellers. This welfare loss usually exceeds the revenue the tax raises for the government. The fall in total surplus, that's consumer surplus, producer surplus, and tax revenue, is called the deadweight loss, DWL, of the tax. A tax has a deadweight loss because it causes consumers to buy less and producers to sell less, thus shrinking the market below the level that maximizes total surplus. The price elasticities of demand and supply measures how much buyers and sellers respond to price changes. Therefore, higher elasticities imply higher deadweight loss. An increase in the size of a tax causes the deadweight loss to rise even more. An increase in the size of a tax causes revenue to rise at first, but eventually revenue falls because the tax reduces the size of the market.